In November 2014, the MacArthur Memorial hosted a World War I Centennial Symposium in partnership with the Hampton Roads Naval Museum and the Old Dominion University Department of History. The following is a lecture by Dr. Frederick Dickinson, one of the symposium presenters. Dr. Dickinson is a professor of Japanese history at the University of Pennsylvania and author of the book War and National Reinvention, Japan in the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Dr. Dickinson presented on the topic of Japan and World War I.
I do want to thank the MacArthur Memorial, also the Hampton Roads Naval Museum and Old Dominion for inviting me here to this wonderful occasion. It is a personal honor and privilege for me, but I also think it's a personal honor and privilege for Asia to be included on the program of World War I. So thank you for that. And I think, you guys thought of it because you have MacArthur. I hate to admit it, but this is the first time I've actually been to Norfolk, even though as a Japan specialist, I should have made my pilgrimage a long time ago. For us Japan specialists, General MacArthur is very dear to our hearts. He is, for us, I do realize he's important in the First World War, but for us, we think of him as the Asian general and one who's was very much involved in the United States going global and going Asia-Pacific in the 20th century. So I think it's very, very apropos. So thanks. I do want to speak of the larger issue of war and Asia and why we should even be worried about Asia today. I think we'll ultimately get there. Just to begin here with my frame of, some of you already know of what the Japanese are up to during the war. This is one of the enterprises. It's the Siberian intervention. We'll get there in a second. But it's not just the Siberian intervention. Of course, this is the usual map of the World War. It's often depicted this way, and this, for obvious reasons, this makes sense. This is the main area of activity. But of course, it is not a European war. It is a world war. And you can see that, of course, much better with this kind of map, and I think this map is quite astonishing. I mean, basically, you notice with this map that almost every country that you can think of on this map is involved in the war in some way. It's only a few sort of areas in Latin America that remain sort of blank. Other than that, it's really super global, and you could sort of talk about any one of these. Of course, I'm only going to be focusing on the East Asia part. But I would sort of keep that in mind. I think for us Americans, it's not too difficult to think of this as a global war because, well, we're not there in Europe, and we know that we played an important part. And so, yeah, obviously it's a global war. But from my perspective as an Asianist, I'm here today to tell you it's not just the Americans that make it global. There are other folks who make it global. And back to this map again. Well, notice, where the United States is. Notice where the sort of connections with the war are the most tenuous. Again, as we observed before, it's Latin America. Almost everywhere else. And particularly if you look at sort of Africa, Middle East, of course, we just heard the very important story about the Balkans and Middle East. But Asia as well, it's basically all colored up. And I think that's a nice sort of reflection of the fact that it's that part of the world. If you're talking about this as a world war, yes, it's this, but it's okay, it starts here, and I think, this is the really most important part. And I'm going to sort of give you the pitch of why we need to sort of think about what's going on here, basically parallel with what we know that's going on here. And just keep in mind, it's happening long before anything is happening over here. To start with, Shaw nicely gave us a picture of sort of contingency in history, and I love that. And I too would like to get away from the sort of structural notion of, slip-slide to war. I will, however, begin with this frame, which shows you, basically, in essence, one of the sort of structural arguments is this war is very much dependent upon the disintegration, slow but steady disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. And so we're back to this map again, and you can see basically timeline-wise how it's working. It's really the Balkan crises, of course, that sort of lead up to this great war, and certainly are among the most important sort of initial triggers. I would just sort of remind you, though, if you didn't already know so, that you have a very sort of similar situation going on in Asia. It's basically a Balkan crisis of the East. And what I mean essentially is China is the Ottoman Empire of the East. In other words, China is in sort of a similar circumstance. China is great sort of long-lasting dynastic empire, so the political, economic, cultural sort of node of Asia, which by the 19th century is getting into very sort of deep trouble in the way that the Ottoman Empire is doing at basically the same time. So you have, difficulties in the Ottoman Empire beginning in the 1830s. Well, Opium War, as you may know, is fought in China between the British and the French to obtain more sort of commercial rights in China. This is happening in 1839 to 1841. You do have then the Sino-Japanese War. That is the Japanese who come online and do defeat the Chinese in war. And basically at this point, by 1895, things are gangbusters. Talk about, okay, who's paying attention to what in the world in the 1890s? Well, sure, the Balkans maybe. I guess this is perhaps a little bit early for the Balkans, but it's certainly not early for Asia. There are those very smart historians in the United States, like Brooks Adams in 1895, who are making the very important comment that it's Eastern Asia which is the prize for which all the energetic nations are grasping. Of course, you can see the sort of social Darwinist language here. It's very much, it's not simply being used in the Middle East, it's not simply being used in the scramble for Africa, it's also being used quite importantly in increasing sort of great power attention to Asia. But essentially what's happening, particularly after the Sino-Japanese War, is great powers scramble to carve out spheres of influence. Okay, you're not taking parts of the Qing dynasty apart, but you are sort of carving out special interests, special ability to create, to put in naval ports, to operate mines, create railroads. Basically, by the eve of the First World War, most of the great European powers own most of the Chinese economy, and they're all moving in various parts of China. Again, this is not formal colonial rule, but basically based upon where they are geographically already in Asia, you have the Russians moving into North China and Manchuria, you have Britain in the Yangtze Valley, you have the Germans after 1895 moving into the Shandong province, which is very near the British. You go south, you see the French moving in, etc. So again, this is not formal colonial rule, but it is substantial. It is a substantial sort of prize that all are waiting to sort of take advantage of. Not only then do you have sort of this great power sort of competition as you see in the Balkans, you do have this other sort of structural issue that one often talks about when we talk about their lead up in the First World War in Europe, and that is you have certain entangling alliances. And of course, for our purposes, the most important one is the Anglo-Japanese alliance. This is quite interesting, particularly just if you remember that the British are, until this time, supposedly sort of abiding by theory or reality of splendid isolation. They're trying their best to not tie formally with certain powers. It is after the Anglo-Japanese alliance that the Entente Cordiale that was mentioned earlier today is coming through, and the Triple Entente. These are coming after the Anglo-Japanese alliance. So for me, the Anglo-Japanese alliance is a wonderful sort of vision of how things are sort of really picking up and important in Asia, to the extent that the greatest naval power on earth is deciding that it must tie its stars with the other rising power of Asia. Of course, this is, from the British perspective, it's particularly in response to its competition vis-a-vis Russia. So we do have sort of great power competition. We have entangling alliances at the same time that we have things going on quite dramatically in Europe. And this really is sort of the general large explanation of why it is that we have this strange phenomena that Japan is, well, if you think about Japan and when it's declaring war, it is declaring war soon after it's asked by the British, and it's asked because they are allies. In fact, the night of this formal invitation, the Japanese cabinet meets and basically says, okay, we've got to do something about this. And they are deciding then to align with Britain to do their best to basically deal with German forces that are in Asia. And for me, it's quite remarkable, again, because this is, if you look at what countries throughout the world, if you go back to the old map, who is sort of plugged into this, for the most part, areas in the Middle East, areas in Africa, areas in Southeast Asia, whatever, they plug in to the war because of their former ties to the empire. Japan has no formal ties. It's not part of any empire itself. It does have an alliance with Britain, and so it is one of the very few powers completely outside of the sort of European orbit that does declare war very early on. August 8, we're talking 1914 here. And sends to the Germans an ultimatum to give up the Qingdao territory, where the Germans had been sort of ensconced since the Sino-Japanese War. And they get a negative response, and that leads basically to a war. Again, just think about the timing here. It's quite impressive. This is the beginning of a very substantial sort of Japanese action in the war from the get-go. By September of 1914, the Japanese are also chasing the German Navy out of the German Micronesia. I'm sorry, this is a Japanese map, but you can see sort of here's the Marshall, Mariana, and Caroline Islands north of the equator, which Japan takes care of. They sort of immediately occupies and takes over, in addition to moving into Qingdao right there, taking over that just 2 months later by November of 1914. And we heard earlier today about the pivotal nature of the Battle of the Marne and how it was a great check to German power. Well, this also was a significant check to German power. Essentially, this is the end of German power in Asia. So in that sense, it's sort of a war that's won. Here we have the Japanese accepting the German surrender in German Micronesia, and here we have the Japanese cavalry kind of coming into Shandong province where Qingdao is located. It doesn't stop there. Even though essentially war against Germany in the Asia Pacific is won by November of 1914, the Japanese do get involved because they're requested to in the war in the Mediterranean in particular. It's the Japanese Navy that gets involved. And, well, first they are involved in convoying British imperial troops from Australia and New Zealand to the Indian Ocean. And there are several Japanese warships that are sent to the Mediterranean after the most serious U-boat threats begin to sort of rise up in the 1917. So between 1917 and 1918, there are Japanese ships active in the Mediterranean, and you may or may not know that there are, in fact, casualties in this war, casualties, that is, Japanese casualties that find themselves today in the island of Malta. There's a grave, especially in the British cemetery there in Malta, that is dedicated to the 78 some odd Japanese sailors who lost their life in the battle against the Germans between 1917 and 1918. It's certainly a concrete involvement in the war. You may not be quite as familiar with this story of Japanese aid in terms of materiel to some of the allies, particularly to the Russians, 600,000 rifles. The Japanese, their economy begins to boom, and so they have a certain leeway and able to sort of offer some aid as well to the allies. And of course, you know the story of the Siberian intervention, whereby this basically ends up being the largest sort of Japanese ground force engagement in the war. It, of course, happens very late in the war, but it nonetheless is another symbol of how Japan is very much involved in this enterprise from 1914 to 1918. Well, 1914 to 1922, essentially, here. And so what we're talking about is, a substantial, at least if you look at where Japan is located, a very concrete sort of tie-in to this European war, tie-in because of the alliance structure, tie-in because of the sort of great power competition that has been sort of heating up in East Asia Pacific since the 19th century. And it is also a reflection of a very substantial sort of economic growth that Japan goes through, sort of very similar to what the United States sees, which essentially catapults Japan from an agrarian country into basically an industrial power. And this is exactly happening at this time, 1914 to 1918, 1919. And you can look at various measures of this, number of exports expanding between this period, manufacturers' goods as part of the exports and becoming very, very important sort of portion of those exports by the early 1920s. And what else do we have here? Japanese population then expanding quite rapidly as well. By 1925, the Japanese are basically the 5th largest country in the world in terms of population. So this is all happening because of the economic boost of the First World War. So on the one hand, they're very much involved in a sort of concrete sort of military action with the Allies. On the other hand, they're sort of making out like gangbusters because they're also helping to supply and sell various things, including shipping, textiles, etc. So very, very important part of the sort of global story of the First World War. And this is not all. The degree to which both the Allied powers and the Central powers are interested in getting the Japanese engaged from the get-go is quite astonishing. Of course, no one after the fact wants to admit that we were groveling for Japanese aid, but it is quite interesting to note simply, again, the fact that the British would go out of their way first to tie an alliance with the Japanese, then to say, okay, please, will you please help us, August 7th, 1914, and then also say, please, will you actually send troops to the Western Front? And this is happening from the get-go, from the British. It's happening from the get-go from the Germans and the Austrians. They are they're trying their best to sort of lure the Japanese into a separate peace because they realize the sort of potential power of Japan to sort of turn the tables. talking about counterfactual, I didn't sort of include it in my remarks, but okay, think about what would have happened after I tell you the whole story. Think about what would have happened had the Japanese gone into the war on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 1915, French request for 500,000 Japanese troops to the Balkans. And when the U.S. gets involved, what do they think of? They think of the Japanese because they've been doing good work in the Mediterranean. So can you come help us as well? Request for Japanese battle cruisers to do exactly what the Japanese have been doing for the British Empire. And this just happens, again, from 1914 all the way through until the end. And you can see the Japanese are very conscious of this. And this is not the only sort of political cartoon you can sort of pull out from the contemporary Japan. But there's any number of very interesting images that shows the Japanese soldier sitting very comfortably with the European maidens, whether they be sort of depicted as goddesses or depicted here as just this innocent maiden saying, please, please, will you please come to the party with us? Thank you. And it's very serious stuff. And I tell you this because this is behind sort of the major sort of geopolitical issue that I want to bring home today, which Japan sort of symbolizes during this war. And that major geopolitical issue is the fact that the Japanese, during the First World War, are becoming for the first time a world power. With the Russo-Japanese War, they are a regional power by 1914 and 1919, just by virtue of the fact that, they are seen as a fairly significant sort of tipping of, they can make a difference. Everyone wants them on their side. And their economy just continues to grow and makes that a reality. And so this is the whole point of why you invite the Japanese to the Paris Peace Conference. The Japanese have a tendency to be a little bit on the silent side, and they were fairly silent at the Paris Peace Conference until it came to something that was very important for them, like Shandong Province. But this is not the point. The point is that they were there, and they were invited to be there, and they were part of the Big Five group that was at the Paris Peace Conference. And this is the first international conference where Japan sits down with the other big boys as number 5. It gets better. At the Washington Conference, they sit down with the big boys as number 3. This is the Naval Conference, of course, in 1921-22, and they're, of course, acknowledged as having the third largest navy in the world. And they're very seriously involved in discussions with the British and the Americans on how we deal with the sort of arms race that is sort of getting out of control after the First World War. And again, a lot has been said about the Washington Conference, subsequent Geneva Conference, and the London Naval Conference. Ultimately, as you know, the Japanese sort of forsake this whole thing, but that comes later. Let's preserve the contingency that Shaw nicely sort of set up for us and just recognize what is happening in 1919, 1922. The fact is the Japanese are very much involved in creating this new sort of international peace structure that is going into place because of the devastation of the First World War. And reflected again in the words of the Japanese Prime Minister, Hara Takashi, in 1920. He says very proudly, at Paris, as one of 5 great powers, the Empire of Japan contributed to the recovery of world peace. So listen to the language here. He's not saying, oh, well, we got what we wanted at Paris. We got Shandong, and we basically, made out very well. But he's saying we participated in the new sort of international discussion on peace. And this is the first. And with this, the empire status has gained not just look what we got, it is look who we are now. We are something much different than what we were in 1914, and we're something much different than what we were in 1905. I said I was going to talk about the principal global implications. You can sort of guess where I'm going from here, but it's not quite what you think. Yes, I would agree with those who have already sort of hinted to the idea that the major sort of global implication of the European war is embodied by this quotation from Sir Edward Grey. If you went online and looked at, did some of the exercises that is sort of accompanying sort of this World War I sort of conference and event that the MacArthur sort of Memorial has produced, they have on that sort of worksheet, they very much sort of bring out this quotation at the very beginning of the war. When Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary of the British, is saying that the lamps are going out. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them again in our lifetime. As it turns out, this was a little bit of an overstatement. Maybe. It depends on how you look at it. Europe was not destroyed by the war. It was very, very significantly maimed. But if you look at the long term, he was, very, very prescient, very, very right. And it's not simply this story again. It's not simply the idea that the First World War is bringing the American century. I would not deny that we have, obviously, a very important shift of power, principally at this event, from Europe to the United States. The U.S. sort of begins to become the decider, so to speak, in political, economic, social, cultural terms. And you can see this, too, by the degree to which sort of American economy, American culture just comes in like gangbusters in Japan, in the 1920s. And that's another whole interesting story that my recent book was about. But anyway, this is clearly important. But of course, I've been talking more about this issue, the issue that, yes, it's the beginning of the American century. Don't forget, it's also the rise of Japan. But the most important thing is not the rise of Japan. It's actually the other part here, and it's not simply the decline of Germany. It seems to me you really do get a picture of where the world is going globally, geopolitically, after 1919, in Asia first, not in Europe. Because what happens in Europe after the First World War? Essentially, yes, the losing empires lose and they implode. Right. Russia, Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, Imperial Germany. Obviously, those guys didn't get the good part of the deal. But even if you sort of think in terms of the French and the British, who won, essentially what happened in Europe and Africa is, well, their empire basically expanded. The largest extent of the British and French Empire is after 1919. It's not before. So even though, Woodrow Wilson is, coming out and would like to sort of talk about self-determination and would like to move beyond an era of beyond empires, well, that's not really happening immediately, at least certainly not in the Middle East, certainly not in Africa. But I would argue that it is very much happening in Asia in a way that is quite shocking. Remember this quotation. Just remember, again, the degree of interest in Asia in the latter 19th century, the degree to which these great European empires were at least plugging into the Chinese economy. It's not a formal empire, but they are very sort of excited about the growth potential and being there on the ground with what's happening. But what happens? This is another episode during the war that I didn't mention. Often it does come up in the discussion of Japan during the First World War. The so-called 21 demands. This is the diplomatic sort of negotiations with China, whereby the Japanese basically negotiate to get all kinds of privileges throughout China. Remember when I showed you the map about great power sort of competition right after the Sino-Japanese War? Basically, every power had their little fiefdoms in various parts of China. The Japanese are going for broke, and they're going for broke because they know they can go for broke because the Europeans are caught up elsewhere. I'm not saying that they're actually taking over China. This is not formal colonial rule, but what does happen is, well, I guess this is a better illustration of it. Again, back to the Siberian intervention. The Siberian intervention is an allied intervention. The Japanese are asked to join, but they don't quite join upon the same sort of terms that the Americans thought they were going to come in when they originally asked them. And what I mean by terms is basically the numbers. For me, the interesting thing about the Siberian intervention just goes to show you the degree to which Japan has become the decider in Asia, in an area where the powers were very interested to be plugged into. Japanese troops, 70,000, no one is anywhere near that. And you can see that again, it's sort of in Japanese, but all colored territories, the orange part here is the Japanese formal empire in Korea and Japanese archipelago, southern Sakhalin Island, but all the rest of this sort of brownish is where the Japanese troops are sort of making their way all the way to Lake Baikal, to Irkutsk, to everyone's astonishment and amazement. And so, what are we going to do? So another nice sort of visual picture of how things are happening very, the First World War causes changes in Asia that are quite substantial, that there's a certain lag in Europe. Of course, it happens in Europe ultimately, but in terms of empire, it's not immediate. So, given this sort of dramatic rise of Japanese power during this time, you've probably heard in the history books about American visions of Japan toward the end of the war, or British visions, and basically they begin to get very nervous. They begin to sort of call the Japanese various names, and the worst thing you can call the Japanese in 1918 is Germany of Asia. So there are various people in the United States, in Europe, who are beginning to sort of associate the Japanese with the terrible sort of militarism and aggression that they see, they describe as the sort of the locus or the beginning of the war in Europe. And this obviously is a very bad thing. This has sort of been sort of incorporated in the historiography as the actual account of what is happening. What I would say is no, Japan is not the Germany of Asia. Japan is simply astonishing everyone by its rise of power, and no one is able to do anything about it. And again, just to give you one other thing, and we're just dealing with China here, basically the idea, not simply that Japan is rising, but that Japan is going to be the sort of determiner of events in Asia. And you have this actually specifically articulated in Japan, even at the beginning of the war. Governor General of Korea, of course, Korea is a Japanese territory, so he's a Japanese general. But basically, by the end of the war, Japan becomes the most important political and economic presence in China. You can look at the chart here. I can't really see it from here, but if you can look at the numbers for Japan, how they change in terms of its investment percentage, and vis-a-vis the British, who are the other most important power. Where are they? Are they up there? Yeah. And just see how the tables begin to turn. I mean, obviously the British are still very important, but the British cannot boast of having the most sort of British nationals actually living in China. You have a very significant Japanese physical presence in China by the end of the war through the 1920s, and this is the beginning of something important. Here we see a Japanese sort of sponsored textile mill with Chinese workers. So essentially what I'm trying to say then is, for me, looking at these events from the perspective of Japan, it is a global vision. It is also an interesting lesson in how we might think of where do we carry the legacy of the First World War. It used to be in the Japanese case, as with Fritz Fischer in the German case, you're looking at the First World War to talk about, okay, what's going to happen in the Second World War. And yes, you could easily tie some of these events happening in Asia, 21 bands or whatever, as sort of the precursor to Japan's sort of very serious effort to sort of begin to take over Asia and articulate a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. I would just, though, borrow from Sean and say, well, hold on, there are a lot of things that happened between that time, and obviously we get there eventually, but there's a whole different story in the 1920s. I'd be happy to talk to you about it later. I won't be talking about it now. But for me, the most important sort of legacy of this war is not how this rise of Japan leads into the Second World War. It's actually how this teaches us the slow, steady movement of the center of sort of political and economic activity and core away from Europe, away from the U.S., and somewhere very different. And if you've been watching the or listening to the sort of current events, we just had the APEC conference in Beijing. And I think this sort of vision of everyone dressing up in Chinese sort of shirts gives you sort of an indication of what, for me, the sort of rise of Japan in the First World War leads to. It doesn't lead to greater East Asia co-prosperity in 1930. It could, and it obviously does. But more importantly, it is the beginning of a very substantial change or shift of center of gravity, global center of gravity from Europe to the Asia Pacific. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, suggestions, or comments, please contact Amanda Williams at amanda.williams@norfolk.gov.